that the Mass State Legislature has passed with help from, great help from him and Margaret Ferrante. And the format is going to be a 20-minute explanation by Bruce of a lot of complicated matters and hopefully some simple terms that we can understand. And then Valerie Nelson of the Cape Ann Coalition is going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask a question, 5 minutes each. And then we're going to be looking at the chat to answer questions and put them together to get some of the most frequent questions. So as we go through this, please use the chat to put any questions you may have for the final 20 minutes, and we'll end promptly at 5. Thank you very much for attending. We look forward to this explanation. So, Senator Tarr, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Dick, and thank you to everyone on the coalition. And it's great to see such a large group of people tuning in for this. And I'm going to try to make this as painless as possible. But in looking out, I also know that there are a great number of people who have a lot of expertise in this area. And so I certainly will offer my thoughts and comments, but I think there's a lot of expertise on the line to be benefited from as well. And I think that's one of the benefits of this coalition. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what's going on. And I want to talk about it in terms of the evolution of climate policy in Massachusetts. And there certainly has been a lot of it. And I want to go back originally to 2008, when we passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which really set the stage for the other steps that have been happening. And the Global Warming Solutions Act was the first piece of legislation that proposed what at the time were thought to be very ambitious goals relative to reducing carbon emissions in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And those goals have since been even further modified. But again, back in 2008, the goal was to have greenhouse gas emissions with a set of reductions that would be achieved by 2020 and a plan for achieving that, and ultimately trying to get to at least 80% of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And as we'll discuss, that goal has been modified, whereas now our goal is to be at zero carbon emissions versus our 1990 benchmark by 2050. Now, what's important about that is since the Global Warming Solutions Act, which I was also a part of helping to put together, was originally passed, the courts have ruled that those emission standards, those reduction requirements, are legally enforceable. And that has definitely changed the complexion of the discussion so that now we understand that these are not merely guidelines, these are enforceable, not goals, these are enforceable requirements that we have to meet. And again, they've been changed largely as a result of the understanding that they now carry the weight of something that is legally enforceable, and they've actually gotten to be more aggressive. And that leads us to what happened back in 2021 in the first part of the current legislative session, when we adopted legislation known as an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy. And again, I apologize because there are a lot of sections to these bills, but I'm going to try to touch on what I think are some of the highlights and elements of the bills that help inform our greater understanding of the whole picture. So one of the things that was important about the bill that passed in 2021 is it did affect those reduction requirements for greenhouse gas emissions that were originally set forth in the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2008. And so to wit, one of the important sections requires the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs to set that zero emission limit by 2050, and that absolute emissions in 2050 are not higher than 85% of 1990 levels. So that's a very significant change from where we were originally with the Global Warming Solutions Act. This puts us on a track to have to achieve much more rigid requirements. And in order to get there, another important part of what I'll call the roadmap bill was to set interim limits. And those are things that many of us have been looking for some period of time, so that we didn't wait until some of the larger years came and didn't have any understanding if we were coming close to where we needed to be. So the interim limits allow us to understand how much progress we're making and how many adjustments we need to make to get to some of the larger reductions in some of the more significant benchmark years. And so the roadmap bill required interim statewide greenhouse gas emissions limits for 2025, 2030, 2040, and 2045. And not only do those limits have to be set forth by the Secretariat of Energy and Environmental Affairs, but they have to be accompanied with a plan on how we're going to get there. So we go from 2008 saying the policy of the Commonwealth is going to be very dramatic greenhouse gas emission reductions, to then having those goals be codified and be legally enforceable, to then in 2021 having interim goals that need to be not only set forth by the Secretariat, but also accompanied by a plan for how we're going to get there. And the roadmap bill even went deeper than that. And so it required the interim 2030 statewide greenhouse gas emissions to be not less than 50% below the 1990 emissions, and the interim 2040 statewide greenhouse gas emissions limit to be not less than 75% below the 1990 emissions level. So again, you see that there's a growing degree of specificity, starting with the larger goal, moving to the interim requirements. The interim requirements require a plan. And then beyond that, a couple of these goals, the 2030 and the 2040, have very, very significant requirements for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the things that's important, and I'm not going to get too much into the 2021 bill, but it also requires a written statement by the Secretary of Environmental Affairs, not more than 18 months after the last day of those interim benchmark dates, by the Secretary of Environmental Affairs to indicate how we've done in terms of compliance. So the requirements are increasing, and the compliance insurance is also increasing and becoming much more significant. Another thing that happened in the 2021 bill, and this is probably the last thing that I'll touch on here, but we see the growing role of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. And one of the things that the 2021 bill did was require at least $12 million to be sent to the Clean Energy Center to develop our workforce. So one of the things that the legislature has been keenly aware of is that reducing our greenhouse gas emissions is not only critically important environmentally for a whole host of reasons, but it also creates an economic opportunity. And in Massachusetts, we have seen significant job growth, particularly in the solar sector, although the pandemic and some of the issues around that caused some of those gains to be lost. But we have seen significant job growth in the solar sector, but we definitely want to grow those jobs in other places as well. And I think we're all aware of the discussion that's been happening relative to the opportunities with offshore wind, and particularly the opportunities with coastal communities. So we know that, for instance, in Salem, there is the major redevelopment of a parcel as a staging area for offshore wind. And we believe that there's the opportunity for the development of that parcel to also create an opportunity for us here in Gloucester, if we can identify the appropriate structural resources on our working waterfront, to be able to have some benefit from that. So that's a little bit about where the roadmap bill took us. It really moved us forward with the interim goals, the compliance mechanisms, and it touched on workforce development. Now, the most recent bill that we passed, very close to the end of the legislative session, the formal legislative session that we just completed for 2022, is a very broad bill that touches on a lot of different areas. And so I'll try to be as succinct as I can, but I want you to bear with me because there were over 90 sections to that bill. And I've picked out some of the sections that I think are the most important to talk about. But basically, the way that I think we need to think about that bill, the most recent bill, which we refer to as Driving Offshore Wind Forward, was really to try to look at some of the vulnerabilities that we have in reaching the goals that we set out originally in the Global Warming Solutions Act and then in the roadmap bill in terms of our interim goals. And so I'm going to just touch on some of these, but one section of that bill directs the Secretariat of Labor and Workforce Development to ascertain what jobs we're going to need to capitalize on the economic opportunity that I mentioned in areas other than solar, so particularly in offshore wind, and provide data to the rest of state government about what those jobs are and what it's going to require to train people for those jobs so that we can gear up for that. In addition to that, the bill amends the directive to the Clean Energy Center about developing markets and workforce to look at businesses and communities that have been underrepresented so far in this form of economic development, and that's very important. Importantly, it also establishes the Clean Energy Investment Fund, which again is going to be administered by the Clean Energy Technology Center to be able to advance research and technologies. I think many of us are aware that right now the CEC has been testing blades, for instance, in the area that's right under the Tobin Bridge in the Boston seaport, and doing great work there to advance the state of the art with the hope that we can be able to develop those blades here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and certainly in the United States, as opposed to having to source them from abroad. We certainly in some cases have to do that, but we'd like to domesticate much more of that industry in Massachusetts. And in addition to that, there's a subtle directive here, but one that's very important to the CEC, to be essentially the clearinghouse for offshore wind technology and to be the focal point for that industry. So as we're seeing Massachusetts climate policy evolve, what we're seeing is a larger and larger role for the CEC so that it can essentially be akin to one-stop shopping for folks that are stakeholders and want to interact with that industry. In addition to that, when we look at growing the economic opportunity in those areas, there's also a directive in this bill, the most recent one, to expand eligibility for grants to look at small-scale energy sources, including hydrogen from non-fossil fuel sources, networked and deep geothermal, and fusion energy. And I know that last comment, given the news over the last few days, is going to attract a lot of attention. And I think it's important to say that in Massachusetts, there has been probably over the last maybe 20 years, but certainly the last 10, a lot of emphasis on trying to look at what historically was called cold fusion, and now is just more generally referred to as fusion, basically the idea of combining nuclei and to have a release of energy rather than splitting atoms and creating energy in that way. And so the eligibility for grant funding has been expanded to include that form of energy. And there is, in fact, at least one company in Massachusetts that's pursuing that idea very aggressively. I think we've still got a long way to go, in my humble opinion, but it's certainly a promising source for the future that the CEC will now be able to give grant support to. There is, in addition, and this is another point of the bill, sort of a doubling down on wind energy. And so the bill creates a Massachusetts offshore wind industry investment program to be able to give no more than $35 million a year in offshore wind tax incentives. And that usually takes the form of a tax credit. It can go in other directions as well. But the idea is that we're really trying to ramp up our offshore wind procurement and trying to be able to attract some of the best companies in the world to be able to come here and prosecute that industry. And so the offshore wind industry investment program is going to develop not only the folks that are going to supply this energy and work on these projects, but also the workforce. And I've already touched on that a little bit to be able to do that. The CEC is going to administer the Offshore Wind Industry Investment Fund, again, keeping with the idea of one-stop shopping. Very importantly, and this is a discussion that's happening, and it's happening in a very intense way in state government and elsewhere, is what is the role of natural gas? And so there is an element of this bill that eliminates natural gas extensions from the CPACE program, which is a funding mechanism that uses some state assistance. And I'll talk more about that later. Along those same lines, there's a component of the bill that prohibits plans that are filed by electric distribution companies and municipal aggregators, our local municipal electric plants, from spending on certain items for new fossil fuel equipment. And this is very important and very significant. So under this directive, the investor-owned utilities and our local municipal electric plants cannot spend money for certain things relative to fossil fuels unless they are being installed as a backup to renewable sources. And most often that combination works out being heat pumps and some sort of a natural gas backup boiler or furnace or things of that nature. So that's very important, and it signals a very important direction for where the Commonwealth is going. In addition to that, I'm just trying to pick through these. Anaerobic digestion. There's been some issue with that and using that to be able to generate energy. And there are provisions in this bill that incorporate some forms of anaerobic digestion into the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard, the so-called RPS, but in a very, very restricted kind of a way so far. Now, one of the things that we all know has been very difficult for us to pursue has been the transportation sector with regard to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the Driving Forward bill does try to address that in a number of different ways. And one of them creates an electric vehicle adoption incentive trust fund. This is the fund that provides rebates for the purchase of electric vehicles. But importantly, it also has been amended to add emphasis to charging stations, because what we've been finding is folks might be able to afford the electric vehicle, but a lot of the advanced charging systems are very costly and beyond the reach of a lot of household budgets. Now, this is very important. So the rebates are going to be between $3,500 and $5,000 for passenger vehicles and light duty trucks, which cost less than $55,000. And this is a point of contention because many of these vehicles cost more than that. And there's an ongoing debate about whether that $55,000 number should be moved even incrementally. And that's something that we're going to continue to debate. In addition to that, the program allows up to a $4,500 additional rebate for low-income households. And that's another important part of this discussion, is that we want to ensure that trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is not something that only folks who are wealthy can participate in. We want to make sure that folks that are of lower income can participate as well. And that's a bit of an elusive goal, but that additional $4,500 rebate is intended to do that. Another section of the bill looks at something that is very important, and that is agricultural land. And a lot of times agricultural land is subject to a lot of restrictions in terms of what it can be used for tax purposes and other state support programs like APRs. And the bill expands the ability of agricultural land to be able to be used for renewable energy production. And so that is very important and something that I think that we're going to spend even more time on in the future. But in the Drive Forward bill, we're at least looking at expanding the use of agricultural land for renewable energy production. And I would point out that in many cases, that benefits not only the environment, but it also helps our family farms. So we're beginning to look at that as well. In addition to that, and this was a piece of the bill that I worked on significantly, we require the Department of Transportation to produce a database of vehicles and where they're registered so that we understand where the electric vehicles currently are, where the fossil fuel powered vehicles are, so that we can plan the infrastructure that's going to be needed to charge and support the electric vehicles over time. Now, Section 46 of the bill has been somewhat controversial, and I want to call your attention to it. And it requires that by 2035, or as of 2035, the sale of a motor vehicle by a dealer, a new motor vehicle that is not a zero emission vehicle, will be considered an unfair or deceptive trade practice under the consumer protection laws of Massachusetts. And so that's very, very significant that essentially after 2035, a new vehicle in Massachusetts, if this remains unchanged, will not be able to be anything other than a zero emission vehicle. Beyond that, we all know the role that TNC companies are playing in our lives, like Uber and Lyft. The bill requires them to submit biennial plans to annually or biannually reduce greenhouse gas emissions on their part as well. Again, you see a focus in this bill on trying to get at the transportation sector because it has been one of the more difficult places to be able to address. And along those same lines, we know that the MBTA is a significant emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the bill requires the MBTA capital plan to prioritize capital investments that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I've only got a little bit more to go, so I apologize. It's a lot of material. But the
5-minute warning.
All right, Dick, I'll do my best. I think I can do it.
All right.
There's another part of the bill that requires the Department of Public Utilities to remove impediments to the development of efficient utility scale, non-emitting renewable thermal energy. And this is another dimension of climate policy in Massachusetts that has been advancing very rapidly over the last couple of sessions. And so this talks about improving or removing impediments to thermal energy, geothermal, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But in addition to that, there are sections in the bill relative to infrastructure replacement. And this specifically relates to our utility companies and replacing gas infrastructure. And so obviously we need them to continue to repair aging and leaking natural gas infrastructure to ensure that it's safe. But there's also provisions here to allow the utility companies to look at maybe replacing some of that infrastructure with pipelines and ducting that can transmit geothermal energy at utility scale. And this is something that particularly came up after we had a lot of the natural gas explosions in Lawrence and North Andover and Andover, where we looked at the transmission system and the density of the housing to see if we might be able to replace transmitting natural gas through the infrastructure with transmitting geothermal energy. Still, we've got a ways to go, but it's important to think about, and that's important. Now, the next section, again, is something that I worked on a lot, and I think we fell short on this one, but I think it's important that we addressed it. And that is the idea of grid modernization and reliability. We are, with all of the requirements and all of the movements that we have toward electrifying space conditioning and transportation, we are increasing substantially electric load. And we must have the ability to transmit electricity and distribute electricity to meet that load. And we have to do that in the context of an aging transmission infrastructure that we have now. So Section 60 of the bill requires electric companies to develop electric sector modernization plans to proactively upgrade distribution and transmission systems. And another part of this section is something that I worked on over the last few years that, again, is very, very important. And I'm reading the question in the chat. We don't have a provision relative to the percentage of electric lines that are required to be buried. But what we do is require the electric companies to forecast electric demand. This is going to be a very important part of what we do going forward. And so they have to have a 5-year forecast a 10-year forecast, and a demand assessment through 2050 to account for future trends. And they have to use 3 planning horizons for that. So you've got the 5-year, the 10-year, and the 2050. And this was a part of the bill that I worked on and amended, because I feel very, very strongly about this, that we need to have an absolute understanding of demand that we're going to have to meet. And then we're going to have plans to be able to meet that demand. In addition, the next section goes back to offshore energy, offshore wind energy, and it removes the decision-making from the utility companies themselves and places it with the Department of Energy Resources, so that there's a more objective judgment of the procurements and the contracts. That's a significant change. And in addition, it directs the DOR to consider certain things, not only the cost of the electricity, but the reliability of the electricity, and also utilizing transmission that might be procured in a separate bid. And that's another piece that I want to speak to. One of the pieces that I worked on adding to this bill was allowing transmission to be bid separately from generation, so that we might find ourselves in a position that somebody wants to create one set of transmission cables from all the offshore projects, so that we can efficiently move that energy without having 3 or 4 or 5 sets of cables coming from 3 or 4 or 5 different locations for the generation of energy. We don't know that that will get us a better price, but we are, through this bill and through the amendments that we added, we're able to now think about that and entertain bids for that. There are, very importantly to us in coastal communities, provisions in the bill that requires environmental protections for offshore wind projects relative to protection of right whales, coastal and marine habitats, natural resources, and ecosystems. Very, very important that as we develop offshore wind, we minimize its impacts. Now, there's certainly going to be impacts, but we want to make sure that people minimize them to the greatest extent. And those things will be carefully considered in bidders, in what they submit for bids. The MBTA will be required under this bill to purchase exclusively zero-emission passenger buses by December 31st of 2040. Again, bidding is allowed just for transmission as opposed to generation. And another section of the bill, section 72, it is again something very important to me. We require at least one rate filing by our electric utility companies to include a plan for storage. Storage is going to be critically important, and I'll talk more about that later, but we require there be a plan for that. And Dick, we're almost at the end, so we're almost there. And let's see, we require the Mass DOT to help our RTAs make the transition to electric buses, and I know that's something that the coalition has been talking about that. One of the things that came straight from Cape Ann is a commission, a commercial fisheries commission that is broadly representative of all the sectors of the fishing industry, to make recommendations about how offshore wind energy production can coexist with our marine fisheries. And the language for that was a product of a lot of work by the Fishermen's Wives Association and by the Northeast Seafood Coalition. I'm very proud that we got a unanimous vote to include that into this bill. So storage, again, we direct DOER to look at long-term storage. It's going to be important. I'll talk more about it later. And there's also an interagency coordinating council that's going to look statewide at where we put charging stations, so that we don't have deserts in Massachusetts where there aren't charging stations, and have too many charging stations in another place where not as many are needed. The School Building Authority, something that we've touched on a little bit in our conversations with the coalition, is directed to look at an energy assessment for all of our school buildings and to make recommendations on how to shift away from fossil fuels. Another very controversial part of this bill is the requirement that the Department of Energy Resources establish a demonstration project in which 10 municipalities can adopt ordinances or bylaws prohibiting new construction that uses fossil fuels in terms of space conditioning. And that was a very controversial part of this bill. One other amendment that I added was a directive for the CEC, the Clean Energy Center, to maintain a publicly searchable database about what electric vehicles are out there and available. Oftentimes we hear that electric powered vehicles cost so much, most of us can't afford them. Well, there are more and more offerings becoming available every single day, and we want people to know what they are. Biomass. There's been a lot of discussion about eliminating biomass plants from the renewable portfolio standard. And in fact, in this bill, they are now eliminated from eligibility for state support in that way.
I think we better wrap it up, Bruce. Yep.
All right, Dick. So
it's a lot to
cover. Mass DOT will develop some incentives for RTAs to be able to adopt electric vehicles. I'm going to breathe. I hope I got through that in a fairly reasonable way.
You know, you made a lot of complex things seem reasonably understandable. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I think this gives a lot of people an incentive to read up and study more about the details of many of these important provisions.
And by the way, Dick, if somebody wants any of this in writing, we're happy to provide it.
Okay. You mean answers to questions or just?
Answers to questions, but also the documents themselves.
Sure. Okay.
And I have pretty good section by section summaries for all of them, which make them much more digestible than reading the original legislative language.
Well, why don't we get those and we can put them in our newsletters?
Okay, we'd be happy to do that.
So Valerie Nelson is going to ask the first question.
So thank you for that, Bruce. I did write down the entire list as you were speaking, and it sounds like a very complicated and impressive bill. I'd like to ask you to pivot over to the budgets, both state and federal money coming down, because there's so much money in the budgets now. And I guess Governor Baker succeeded in getting federal allocations of money before he's out of office. So that money can be almost as significant as some of the policy in the legislation. So could you describe what that money is going for, what the legislature agreed to, where federal money is coming in, and how that's going to affect the ability of individuals and communities and utilities to actually transition towards some of these goals? What happened this year with the flood of money, state and federal?
So Val, this again is a complicated question, but I'm going to give you the best succinct explanation I can. It will be shorter than the last one. So let's start with.
You've only got 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Go.
Let's start with the most significant funding that came through in FY22, $50,000 for the Cape Ann Climate Coalition to be able to have these discussions. And in 2023, $200,000 for the Cape Ann Climate Coalition. And that's directly as a result of the partnership that Ann Margaret and I have with all of you. And we really appreciate that and appreciate the work that you're doing. In the economic development bill that we most recently passed, that you know was delayed for a long time, and we actually adopted it very late in the legislative session, there's about $540 million for clean energy and climate resiliency initiatives. I'm going to run through them really quickly. $250 million to accelerate and support clean energy initiatives, and $100 million of that is to promote the adoption of more electric vehicles. And I talked about some of the programs in my last explanation that will support. $100 million for ports and port infrastructure to support offshore wind. $50 million for the Mass Clean Energy Center to accelerate the transition to an expansion of renewable energy. And Val, I would call your attention to that because I know you're always looking for places to go to look. The Clean Energy Center is going to have a lot of money going forward. And you know, we're going to need to work with them to be able to get that money flowing to Cape Ann. And Ann Margaret and I are happy to do that. $175 million for the conservation and improvement of publicly owned lands and green spaces. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. In fiscal year 2023, the budget includes $375.2 million for environmental services, again, for the protection of open spaces. In fiscal year 2022, the budget included $13 million for a trust fund to grow technical training programs for offshore wind in public higher education and vocational technical institutions. An opportunity there for Gloucester High School and the Gloucester Public Schools. And then in December of 2021, with the money that the federal government gave us, the so-called ARPA money, we put $100 million into environmental infrastructure grants, including municipal vulnerability preparedness, and $6.5 million for clean energy retrofitting in affordable housing units, and $5 million for the advancement of geothermal technologies. Now, I will say this, a lot of the funding that is going to come from the federal legislation is not going to pass directly through state government. And this is something that we all have to work on, because a lot of it is going to be on a nationwide competitive basis. And it's going to flow directly from the federal government to the grant applicant. And we're going to need to do some work on that. And we're actually working with Congressman Moulton's office on maybe putting together a presentation on how that's going to work.
So one major thing is that clean water funding could be of great use to Gloucester when it goes for its secondary wastewater treatment plant. Was that part of this federal bill as well?
Yes, it was. There is, and I'm trying to find it, but we put $100 million for water and sewer infrastructure investments through the Clean Water Trust. So as you know, the way that the state supports water and sewer projects in municipalities is through two trust funds, two state revolving funds that give out 0 interest or 2% interest loans to the municipalities, which when you consider that discount is usually a pretty sizable grant equivalent. We put $100 million in the ARPA bill, and then more money than that, another, I believe it was $150 million in the economic development bill into those trust funds to be able to buy down the debt and eliminate it, so that the municipalities don't even have to borrow against it. We'll just extinguish it. So, and I predict you may see more of that to come.
So that's probably the biggest budget item for Gloucester, at least, is helping with the wastewater treatment plant. Yeah,
it absolutely is, and I think Gloucester will be the beneficiary of those contributions to the trust fund, particularly the Water Pollution Abatement Trust Fund, which is the account that funds sewer improvements. There is no doubt that that fund is going to play a major role in Gloucester's treatment plant. And the hope is that the additional dollars will help what Gloucester has to borrow be for less.
Right.
So one question that I was thinking, and you've sort of alluded to this, but what are the major impacts from this bill on Cape Ann? And what can we as a coalition help to explain and act in our catalytic role to people to build support for and build understanding of? What are the top three, say? I mean, I think I say right away, I agree with you on the grid, but that's a huge lift. And I mean, I know some, like Bombco, for example, is extremely worried about the electrical reliability because they have changed from gas to electric for all their furnaces. And it's a big business threat to them that the grid won't be able to handle their future.
You're absolutely right, Dick. And I would say that modernizing the grid is a big, sort of a large scale thing. Right. But what we can think about a little bit on Cape Ann is whether or not we want to have some microgrids that might be able to benefit from a renewable energy that's generated and be able to kept locally, either behind the meter or in front of the meter. But my top three would be, number one, helping to get more of these dollars here for increased charging stations for electric vehicles. Number two, working with the Regional Transit Authority to be able to increase renewable energy powered vehicles. They've already started to look at that, and Kate has been a good partner. And number three, really thinking about how we can produce some energy storage on Cape Ann. And that ties in with the microgrids. One of the difficulties that we're going to have is that renewables, as you know, wind and solar energy are intermittent, and they don't produce energy 100% of the time, but baseload demand is 100% of the time. And we need to think about how to develop on a distributed basis all across Massachusetts storage so that we can supply the energy demand that we have with energy that was produced from renewables and stored, rather than have to activate a peaking power plant or trigger the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity. And we could have an entire session on that.
Yeah, I think we might want to do that. I mean, Town Green is going to be considering its 2023 priorities in January, but I think microgrids and storage for particularly first responder institutions and the hospital is right up there to get a feasibility grant to figure that out. One of the things the Harvard study pointed out was that we have enough solar capability that's not tapped yet in municipal and private commercial and private residential areas to give all of our electricity by double what we need right now. So we don't have to, use all of it, but we certainly have the capacity to tie that into microgrids with batteries and be independent distributed sources.
There's no question that local generation is going to continue to be important. Sorry.
No, I'd like to go back to, you mentioned the Fisheries Commission on the offshore wind. Obviously, we get questions around this as a fishing port. And one of the questions in the chat today is any of that port funding or any energy funding for more fuel efficient boats or investment? Can we get investments in our port? And how do you view the fishing industry playing a role in the offshore wind? What are your thoughts about what their concerns are, or why you put that commission in?
Well, the fishing industry is going to play a pivotal role in the development of offshore wind because we do not want to extinguish their survival to be able to get a resource that we need. They also produce a resource that we need in terms of a protein resource. And there's a lot of concern in the fishing industry about where some of these projects are going to be located. We know where the federal lease parcels are down to off of southeastern Massachusetts and even further south than that. But the newest concern, Val, and I know you know this, but for the edification of people who are listening, is the Gulf of Maine, which has historically been a very rich fishing ground for codfish and other species. And the proposals now are going to be for floating wind energy production, offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. And the density of those projects could be a significant problem because we know that fish migrate and they're mobile and they're not always in one place on the same day. So you can't say that, okay, this area, there's no fish today, so we're going to put all the floating offshore wind platforms. You can't do that. So we got to think through that. And that's a huge thing. That's why we created that commission. Now, I know I also saw in the chat, there was a question about improving the fuel efficiency of the vessels. And Representative Ferrante has worked a lot on that and has worked on funding, and we can talk more about that later, to be able to make vessels more fuel efficient. And I put into a bond bill a couple of years ago an earmark to look at replacing vessels with more fuel efficient vessels. The difficulty is always going to be that, as we know, that the revenue of the fishing industry is constrained right now for a variety of reasons that I won't get into here. So you're asking folks that don't have the capacity to fund these improvements to carry the burden of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we're working on that on two fronts, some bond money and also some operational dollars. And I'll get you some more information that hopefully can be shared about some of our initiatives on that front.
And federal money? Do you see the port federal money as a source?
Potentially.
Great. And then on the environmental arena, we do appreciate that 200,000 to start looking at our ecosystems, coastal, forested uplands, and green infrastructure downtown and whatever. How much of the federal and state money will go for coastal restoration, nature-based solutions over time? Is a significant amount going for that?
Yes, well, the MVP program right now that funds cities and towns is very substantial. And so we will be continuing to put more money into that. And Gloucester has benefited from that already. And I believe some of the other Cape Ann communities have as well. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but right now, that's the principal vehicle for doing that. But in addition to that, there's a lot of work being done, and you and I have talked about this in the Great Marsh, because the Great Marsh is one of the best resources we have to absorb carbon that's already in the atmosphere, and also to help us deal with sea level rise and attenuate energy from storms, hurricanes, and ocean-based storms. So we have been leading the way, and I would argue that on the North Shore, we have been leading the country in terms of developing those natural resources as a means to combat the threat of climate change and sea level rise. And over the course of the last several years, we've been putting between $100,000 and $200,000 into marsh revitalization efforts. But the good news is those dollars have leveraged millions of federal dollars in terms of doing things like eliminating Phragmites so that the marsh can continue to thrive and grow. And we're doing things like looking at thin layer deposition, which is where you put dredge spoils in thin layers on the marsh and allow the vegetation to grow through it and continue to elevate the marsh to keep pace with sea level rise. So there's going to be a lot of resources available for that. And right now, in the area from Cape Ann to the New Hampshire border, we're really at the epicenter of a lot of the leadership in this country on those issues.
That's great to hear. So Cape Ann can make strides in adopting some of those things and with state help.
Absolutely.
Great.
I think that our purpose in doing this is just to explain the bill in the kind of language you're good at, to simplify it for our audience, but also to deepen our relationship with you, because you've been very helpful to the coalition and to Town Green, and to help us get the resources we need, and to serve as a information conduit to us, to the decision makers. We hope that can continue, and we are looking for you to participate in, our overall mission is to bring the 4 communities of Cape Ann to understand and work with each other in a deeper way, and ultimately to collaborate, as independent as they are. There's going to be a lot of opportunity. And if you could just speak a little bit about that in your closing, maybe take a couple minutes here to close, but the potential for Cape Ann to unite more, to collaborate more, to address these huge issues.
So thanks, Dick. Let me first say right back at you. The coalition is incredibly important, and what you communicate to us is very helpful. Our discussions are very helpful. And I think, as you could pick up from some of what I've said this afternoon, all of you have inspired some of the most important things that we have done legislatively. And I always like to say that Beacon Hill doesn't have a monopoly on wisdom. Some of the best ideas that make their way into legislation come from people in our communities that are interested in these issues. And this coalition is a very powerful example of that. So you can count on me to continue the discussion. And I think sometimes, Dick, it's helpful when we have a little bit narrower discussions focused on some things, sort of focus groups. And that could be an important thing as we move forward. But I feel that Cape Ann is incredibly important as a geographic unit to be able to work together and to be able to do things that will be pioneering relative to public transportation, relative to microgrids, relative to distributed generation on our rooftops and in our open spaces, and we need to preserve those open spaces, relative to carbon sequestration. These are all things where we are uniquely poised to be able to, and situated to be able to take action and develop measurable results. Because of the compact nature of our geography, we can measure things better than maybe other places can. We have a lot of diversity in terms of neighborhoods where there's more open space, neighborhoods where there's more density of housing. We have a lot of ability to be able to pilot things and pioneer things by working together. But it's also, in my opinion, a little bit unfair and unreasonable to ask any one community to take on all of that. And so when you pull people together, I think everyone is pretty familiar with my belief in regional approaches to things, whether it be coastal erosion or drought or whatever. And I think in this case, we are really situated. And I'll tell you this, the fact that 45 people right now are talking about this issue at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, speaks a lot about the enthusiasm and the resourcefulness of people on Cape Ann to do this.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we'll wrap it up now. We look forward to getting that annotated explanation of the bill, because I think that would be helpful. How do you guys think about it in your office? And we can share that. And we look forward to further discussions. And I want to thank everybody for participating and being with us. And you can email your questions further. We'll take note of the chat questions we didn't get to. And we'll be summarizing this in our newsletters. And there'll be a recording posted on the Cape Ann Coalition website for you to look at. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Senator Tarr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. And happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you.